Hey everybody, it's Todd Costello from RE/MAX Center Realty. It is October and it is time for the monthly value message. This month we're going to talk about how the new rules and guidelines that the National Association of Realtors agreed to based on some lawsuits affect the commissions from the seller's perspective. Last month we did the buyer's perspective. So we're going to jump right in, and I want to start with this is how it has been. For approximately the last 150 years, this is how commissions were working in the residential real estate market. So the commissions have always been negotiable. That's number one. They've always been negotiable, but let's say a 5% commission, 6%, 7%. We've heard these numbers if you sold a home, if you have family members that have sold a home. And the way it worked for all those years is the seller's agent would charge the seller a commission, a negotiable commission, and then that full commission, whatever the negotiated amount was, would go to the seller's agent. And the seller's agent would then share a percentage of that, approximately half, with the buyer's agent. Furthermore, the buyer's agent, they knew how much they were being compensated, how much they were being incentivized with the seller through the MLS. The MLS is the multiple listing service, and that is where all realtors, local realtors, are members of the board of realtors, and we share all the listing information with each other through the MLS. So this is how it had worked for 150 years. The change, the significant change, is this. From a disclosure standpoint, the seller's agent, they were never, I guess, required, but the common practices were that they would be shared. But now the seller's agent is negotiating the seller's agent fee with the seller, and then they are asking the seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, do you want to incentivize, do you want to compensate a buyer's agent to show your home and bring buyers to it? That is not assumed anymore. As a matter of fact, it's not assumed, and it's not shared in the multiple listing service. So you list your home, you're going to negotiate with your seller's agent what they're going to charge you, and then you're going to talk additionally about whether or not you want to compensate a buyer's agent to bring buyers to your home. So this is how it worked. And, excuse me, this is what I think my clients and Center County families need to know. So we're talking about seller paid commission. Number one, as we talked about, they've always been negotiable. You will negotiate with your agent. But, clearly, you get what you pay for. So from a professional standpoint, knowing the market, availability, response time, and just general professionalism, you want to keep in mind that they're negotiable, but you want a certain level of service expectation and expertise. Number one. Number two, the seller's agent fee, as we talked about. You are going to talk to your agent about their fee to represent you, the seller. So that's going to be a fee. And then the buyer's agent fee is not required, and it's no longer disclosed in the MLS. That's very important because now every buyer that wants to look at a home, that wants to have a buyer's agent, a buyer cannot look at a property without having a signed contract with the buyer's agent. And that contract is going to outline what the buyer is willing to pay, what they negotiated to pay their own buyer's agent. So if you are not willing to pay the buyer's agent, the buyer is going to have to pay the buyer's agent. And a buyer cannot be represented by a realtor without hiring that realtor and signing a contract. It is no longer allowable for a realtor to show a buyer a property without a signed agreement as their buyer's agent. That is no longer allowed. Things that you want to consider based on these changes. The buyer pays if you won't. So technically, what I've experienced, it's only been 2 months or even less than 2 months, many sellers are continuing to offer an incentive, to offer a buyer agent fee, because they're realizing, hey, I want the realtors to show my home. And if you put your home on the market and you say, I do not want to compensate or incentivize the buyer's agent, well, then you need to understand that if a buyer's agent is showing your home, they've got a signed contract required that says the buyer has to pay. So whatever your list price is, the buyer that has a realtor that you won't compensate is going to say, okay, that's the asking price for the seller, plus I have to pay my agent. So in their eyes, your listing is going to be higher priced. Very important. Number two, you want to consider the current market conditions and the demand rate. As an example, I did some research. It's all posted to my website, toddcostello.com. The current demand rate for October, the demand rate is the ratio between active buyers and sellers, is 66%, which means there's 0.66 of a buyer for every one seller. So there's, closer to half as many buyers as there are sellers right now, 66%. So if a lot of sellers are continuing to offer buyer agent fee, and then you're not, and you're entering a market with, not super hot demand, it's not unhealthy, but it's not high demand, well, okay, I'm not willing to incentivize the buyer's agents, I'm not willing to compensate them, and I also want to get my home sold for top dollar when the demand rate's only 66%. It's something you want to consider, is the demand rate when you're deciding whether or not you want to compensate the buyer's agents. As an example, the peak demand rate in 2022, that's the highest demand in my 30-year career, was 281%. That means there were 2.81 buyers for every one seller. If the demand gets that high, perhaps you can say, well, you know what? Maybe it'll sell anyway, and I can save a couple of dollars. But under current market conditions, I think you have to think long and hard about really disincentivizing the buyers and disincentivizing the buyer's agents to show your home by not offering them some type of compensation. Number three, who is representing the buyer? Someone or no one. If a buyer wants a buyer's agent to represent them, as we've talked about, they have to sign an agreement. They have to sign a contract with that buyer's agent outlining the buyer's agent fee that the buyer's going to have to pay. If a buyer says, I want to look at that property, but I don't need an agent, well, how are they going to look at the property? And they're going to be unrepresented. And to work with a buyer who's unrepresented is a very difficult situation in my experience, in that if you're not aligned with a realtor, and let's say I'm your seller's agent and an unrepresented buyer wants to purchase your home, I'm going to be asking that unrepresented buyer, hey, I need your proof of funds. You need to show me your bank statements that you have the cash. I need to know where you work. I need to know if you currently own a home and you need to sell it in order to buy. So someone has to represent the buyer, because if no one does, then your risks are much higher. So the bottom line with the new commission structures and options are these. These are the highlights, the things that you want to be aware of. The guidance that I'm giving all of my seller clients currently is and recommendations. Hey, I make recommendations, my clients make decisions, but my recommendations are clear. You should continue to offer an incentive to the buyer's agents to show your home. And the way they know that, if a buyer agent wants to show my listing, we actually have to call each other. Anytime I show a buyer a property, I need to call the seller's agent and ask them, since it's not posted anymore, I need to ask them if they're willing to compensate me. So my buyer client always knows if they're going to have to pay me or if the seller's willing to pay me. That's a very, very important component. So that's an overview this month. There's more details involved when you're getting ready to sell. Give me a call with as much advance notice as possible so we can cover this in detail and how it's going to affect you and your family. Otherwise, as always, the agent that you choose is the most important decision you're going to make. There's a lot more variables in negotiation now, and those variables are more complex, and you need an experienced agent to represent you to get through with the best result. And as always, you can go to toddcostello.com to look at the data, to look at the historical demand rates, and share this with someone you care about. It's important information. I will catch you next month.